영어 동화 세상 리틀팍스.
Famous disasters. Tsunami 2004. What happened on December 26th, 2004? One Sunday morning in Thailand, two brothers, 8 and 12 years old, set out for a day at the beach. It was a clear morning with the promise of more good weather ahead, and the boys were looking forward to swimming and playing. They had no notion that 800 miles away, a huge undersea earthquake was sending devastation their way. The boys' village, Khao Lak, was a village very much like others that bordered the Indian Ocean. Many of its residents made their livelihood from fishing or working in the hotels visited by thousands of foreign tourists each year. The morning was unusually quiet, but as the boys approached the beach, they heard a strange roaring sound. Suddenly, they spotted an enormous wave, unlike anything they'd ever seen, hurtling toward them. Thinking fast, the brothers scaled nearby trees just before the deadly wall of water exploded across the shore, swamping the beach and the area around it. From the treetops, the boys watched in shock and horror as the people below tried desperately to cling to tree trunks and branches to save themselves. Beneath their feet, the rushing water swept away cars, boats, parts of buildings, and people's belongings. The boys waited until things seemed calm. Then they dropped down and started for home, traveling across a frightening, dripping landscape filled with mud, debris, and injured people. The exhausted boys finally found their mother, who hugged them fiercely. Their house was gone, and their father was missing. Still, the boys and their mother were among the fortunate ones. They had survived, while hundreds of thousands of other people along the coastlines had perished. A tsunami strikes. The Indian Ocean tsunami was one of the worst disasters ever to occur on Earth. The tsunami was set off by a powerful underwater earthquake, one that came without warning and found the people of the Indian Ocean basin completely unprepared. The tsunami first reached Banda Aceh, a region in northern Indonesia. Other countries close to the earthquake's starting point included the Maldives, Sri Lanka, and Thailand. The tsunami eventually ranged as far as the east coasts of India and Africa. Within hours, it had wreaked havoc on 2 continents and thousands of lives. Up to 230,000 people are believed to have perished in the tsunami. At least 40,000 more went missing. Entire towns were destroyed. Hundreds of thousands of people lost their homes. The tsunami even reshaped the landscape, swamping tiny islands and coral reefs, and flooding crops and farmland. Altogether, the tsunami caused approximately $12 billion of property damage. Recovering from all these losses and rebuilding homes and lives has been a long and difficult process. What caused the tsunami? Tsunamis are giant waves caused by violent movement in the seabed, which comes from an earthquake, an undersea volcano, or a landslide. Most tsunamis remain at sea and do not generate giant waves that crash onto shorelines. A very powerful earthquake, however, can send waves hurtling hundreds of miles across the ocean and as far as a mile onto land. This was true of the 2004 earthquake. It registered 9.2 on the Richter scale, a system used by scientists to classify the intensity of earthquakes. Vibrations from this quake were detected all around the world. How do tsunamis trigger killer waves? Earth's crust is made up of giant sections called tectonic plates that fit together like a jigsaw puzzle. The edges of these plates meet at fault lines, which are great cracks in the crust where earthquakes most often occur. When one tectonic plate suddenly slips beneath another, a tremendous amount of energy is released, and this energy is transferred to the water. Imagine dropping a very large rock into a bathtub and watching the water splash outward from that center point. The water has been displaced and needs somewhere to go. In this case, all over the bathroom floor. In an ocean basin, the principle is basically the same. The displaced water moves outward from the earthquake's starting point, or epicenter, sending out powerful waves in all directions. Help from around the world. Immediately after the Indian Ocean tsunami, assistance poured into the affected areas. At Khao Lak, Thai military aircraft brought medical supplies and food. There, and in other locations around Asia, doctors, nurses, and ordinary citizens arrived to help people who were injured or sick. Relief workers brought food, water, and clothing, and set up shelters and medical facilities to comfort people left homeless and grieving. Many tourists stayed to help. Teams created computer databases to try to track the missing people. Tents were provided for families, while temporary housing was constructed. Millions of people who had just celebrated Christmas with their families viewed the devastation on TV and in newspapers. Moved by the plight of victims who had lost homes and family members, many individuals donated money, food, clothing, and basic supplies. Help came from all over the globe. Tsunami warning systems. After the Indian Ocean disaster, many people wondered how to prevent devastation from future tsunamis. In 2005, a United Nations conference in Kobe, Japan, led to the establishment of the International Early Warning Program. Modeled after the Pacific Tsunami Warning System in Hawaii, the IEWP is made up of 25 undersea stations and 3 deep-sea sensors that sit on the ocean floor in areas where earthquakes often occur. These devices relay information to 26 national tsunami information centers. Greater awareness and understanding about tsunamis can also help save lives. People can be educated to look for and respond correctly to warning signs. For instance, just before the Indian Ocean tsunami struck, people on the coast observed that the water was suddenly sucked back out to sea. Rocks were exposed, and fish flopped on the wide plain of mud. Many people were fascinated by this occurrence and stayed to watch rather than run for higher ground. If people had recognized this warning sign, they would have known it was time to evacuate. This awareness could have saved their lives. Hope for the future. The 2004 Indian Ocean tsunami was a terrible tragedy. Hundreds of thousands of people died, and many others suffered devastating injuries and losses. The lives of the 2 brothers who played on the beach that morning were changed forever. They lost their home, and much worse, they lost their father, who was never found. Still, this violent tsunami has taught us many valuable lessons. The 2004 tsunami showed us how important it is to continue researching tsunamis and developing ways to forecast them. We have also seen how critical it is to warn people of their approach. And we have found new ways to help one another when a disaster of great magnitude strikes. This brings hope that the massive devastation of the 2004 tsunami will never be repeated.
Little Fox.
Famous disasters. The influenza epidemic of 1918. The Blue Death. In late September of 1918, near the end of World War I, a soldier was brought to the hospital at Camp Devens outside Boston, Massachusetts. He was feverish and aching so badly that he screamed whenever he was touched. In the days that followed, hundreds of more men poured into the hospital with similar symptoms. The highly contagious illness had swept through the large camp, almost a city itself, with over 50,000 men. Soon, the hospital didn't have enough beds for the soldiers. Many stood outside in the chilly air, often in the rain, waiting for treatment as they clutched blankets and grew weaker. In the month of September alone, more than 12,000 soldiers were reported as having the disease. Most of the 6 soldiers at Camp Devens recovered, but according to one of the doctors working there, approximately 100 men a day came down with pneumonia. Their lungs filled with blood, which poured from their noses and mouths, and they literally drowned to death. People soon began calling the disease the Blue Death, because victims' skin often turned blue, an indication that death was near. Meanwhile, these soldiers at Camp Devens, some in the early stages of the illness, before it could be detected, were being shipped overseas to fight. On the battlefields of Europe and Asia, the Blue Death spread like wildfire, soon infecting the civilian population as well. A pandemic, or worldwide epidemic, had begun. Influenza. Most influenza pandemics start in Asia, but the 1918 pandemic originated in 3 countries, the United States, France, and southern China, and spread in waves from each of these places. Some experts think that half of the world population was eventually infected. In the United States, about 600,000 people lost their lives. India was hit particularly hard, with some estimates of nearly 20 million deaths. Even remote areas were not immune. Villages in the far reaches of Alaska were completely wiped out. The 1918 flu epidemic is also known as the Spanish influenza. Spain was a politically neutral country during World War I. This meant that Spanish newspapers were not censored as they were in other countries. So Spain was the first nation to report on the dangerous new flu attacking its population. The Spanish influenza epidemic was unusual in one key way. Most of the infected people were between 20 and 40 years of age. Children were frequent victims too. Many kids got the disease themselves or lost their parents from it. The illness struck so many households in the United States, a popular jump rope rhyme soon acquired chilling new words. I had a little bird, and its name was Enza. I opened the window, and in flew Enza. Dangerous misconceptions. One reason the epidemic caused so much illness and death was that people did not understand how contagious it was. It was wartime, so people were traveling to different countries and bringing the illness with them. And people with mild cases of the flu thought they just had colds, so they went to work or school, which helped the virus spread further. As more people grew seriously ill, public health departments reacted strongly, and fear turned into panic. Schools and workplaces were closed, and public gatherings such as church services and parades were banned. Throughout the world, people wore gauze masks to try to protect themselves from infection. But the masks didn't do much to stop the disease from spreading. People wearing them could still breathe in small particles of the influenza virus. Many people also relied on folk remedies to keep infection away. They hung garlic from their necks, left windows wide open in winter, and even stuffed salt up their noses. Some Americans use laxatives as a treatment for the flu, while others turned to addictive substances such as alcohol. Public health officials did their best to try to manage the crisis. But with neither a vaccine nor any reliable treatments, all they could do was focus on educating people about prevention. They printed posters, cartoons, and pamphlets that offered advice on how to stay healthy. But even these government documents contain misinformation. According to one pamphlet, people could keep the flu away by chewing food carefully and making sure their shoes weren't too tight. What is influenza? Influenza is a highly contagious disease caused by the influenza virus. The symptoms of the flu, fever, body aches, coughing, pass within 2 weeks. But if the virus infects the lungs, pneumonia can develop. While pneumonia is usually treatable, it can lead to death. Seasonal flu viruses occur each year, usually during the winter. Influenza pandemics, however, occur only a few times each century, and they behave differently than outbreaks of seasonal flu. Influenza pandemics involve a new strain of the flu virus, one to which people haven't built up any immunity. The new virus tends to strike harder and with worse symptoms. Vaccines are developed each year to treat seasonal flu, but in the case of a pandemic, it can take longer to develop a vaccine. In the meantime, many people can die. Two other pandemics, the Russian flu of 1889 and the Asian flu of 1957, together killed millions. The 1918 Spanish influenza was by far the worst in recent history, killing from 20 to 50 million people worldwide. More people died from the Spanish flu than from fighting in World War I. Flu prevention. In the years since 1918, great strides have been made in understanding influenza. Scientists have developed vaccines for the seasonal flu, and the public is better informed about how to cope with it. In 2009, a new pandemic, caused by the H1N1 or swine flu virus, made its appearance, and researchers immediately rushed to educate people and develop vaccines. Many people, especially children and young adults, were immunized by local health agencies. Despite predictions of a massive spread of H1N1, experts announced in December 2009 that the pandemic had been milder than expected. There are some simple things each person can do to prevent the flu. To begin with, get the seasonal flu vaccine. If you are in a risk group for the H1N1 virus, get that vaccine too. Wash your hands frequently with soap and water or an alcohol-based hand rub. Cover your nose and mouth with a tissue when you sneeze, and then discard the tissue. Avoid touching your eyes, nose, and mouth, as this can spread germs. After the crisis. Eventually, life at Camp Devens in the United States returned to normal. In January of 1919, some soldiers even entertained others at the camp by putting on a musical play, C'est la guerre, That's War, about life in the military. By then, the worst of the crisis had passed at the camp, and the soldiers were trying to put the grim time behind them. There's no guarantee that a pandemic as devastating as the 1918 Spanish flu won't occur again. But with our advanced understanding of the influenza virus and our ability to quickly develop vaccines, we now hold many more tools for preventing it.
Little Fox.
Famous disasters, September 11th, 2001. The attacks. On September 11th, 2001, American Airlines Flight 11 took off from Boston at 7:59 in the morning. Moments after the seatbelt sign was switched off, two men got up from the second row, approached two female flight attendants, and stabbed them. More hijackers broke into the cockpit, overpowering the pilots. In just minutes, the 5 hijackers of Flight 11 had gained full control of the plane and its passengers. September 11th started as an ordinary morning for the thousands of men and women who worked in the Twin Towers of the World Trade Center, the tallest skyscrapers in New York City. But all that changed at 8:46, when Flight 11 slammed into the North Tower. The plane ripped through 7 floors, sending the tower swaying and instantly killing hundreds of people. These 5 hijackers weren't working alone. About 15 minutes later, a second hijacked plane, United Airlines Flight 175, slammed into the South Tower. As people frantically raced to escape the burning buildings, some even jumping from windows, rescue personnel rushed to the site. Almost all of Lower Manhattan was evacuated, creating confusion on the streets. News of the disaster spread quickly. At schools and workplaces all over the world, people stopped what they were doing to turn on the television or call loved ones. Then, at 9:59, the South Tower collapsed. Half an hour later, the North Tower collapsed too, shrouding Lower Manhattan in dust and smoke. Soon, news stations were reporting the fates of two more hijacked planes. One had flown into the Pentagon, the nation's military headquarters in Washington, D.C. The other plane, headed for either the White House or the Capitol building, had crashed in rural Pennsylvania after a brave attempt by passengers to take back control. By 10:30 that morning, nearly 3,000 people had perished, with thousands more injured or missing. New York City's skyline had been drastically altered. Washington, D.C. was in chaos, and people all over the world were stunned and terrified. 9/11 had become a day that changed the world. Who was behind the attacks? Investigators soon uncovered strong evidence that a Muslim extremist named Osama bin Laden and his terrorist group, Al-Qaeda, were responsible for the attacks. American President George W. Bush responded by declaring a global war on terrorism. This war was aimed at bin Laden and Al-Qaeda as well as the Taliban, a militant Islamic group that had taken over most of Afghanistan. The American government believed that the Taliban was supporting bin Laden and Al-Qaeda and sponsoring terrorist training camps. As Muslims, bin Laden and the members of Al-Qaeda follow the religion of Islam, along with over 1 billion other people in the world. But as extremists, they believe that American life is offensive to the teachings of Islam. In their eyes, it is the duty of Muslims to destroy American people and ways of life through violent and extreme means. This is very different from the messages of peace and kindness practiced by most Muslims. The U.S. and the world respond. On October 7, 2001, the U.S. and its allies attacked Kabul, Afghanistan. The purpose of the attack was to capture bin Laden and bring down the Taliban. Over the next 2 years, a total of 53 countries joined the U.S. in its fight against terrorism. President Bush also announced the creation of the Department of Homeland Security. Working with other federal agencies, this department tightened security along America's borders, as well as inside airports and other public places. Government employees were put in charge of screening baggage, and passengers had to pass through metal detectors and have their luggage X-rayed. People all over the world were no longer allowed to carry sharp objects on flights. In addition, the U.S. government passed the Patriot Act. This act gave more freedom to law enforcement agencies to search people's telephone and email communications, as well as their medical, financial, and library records. It also granted immigration authorities more power to detain and deport immigrants suspected of terrorism-related acts. Many people strongly objected to this expansion of government power. They were concerned that it would lead to discrimination of immigrants and violate people's rights to privacy. Ground Zero. The area where the Twin Towers had collapsed became known as Ground Zero. Workers and volunteers spent months here, searching for victims among smoking mounds of rubble. Each day, trucks and barges transported thousands of tons of material from Ground Zero to a nearby landfill, so workers could sift through the debris for human remains as well as evidence from the planes. For many workers, this was a difficult and upsetting task. After the areas of the attacks were cleaned up, it was time for rebuilding. At the Pentagon, the damaged section of the building was restored within a year, and a memorial was built a few miles away. In Pennsylvania, at the field where the fourth plane crashed, the government decided to build a memorial, a chapel with 40 wind chimes to honor the plane's 40 passengers and crew members. It took a long time to decide what to do about the World Trade Center. Some people thought the towers should be rebuilt exactly as before, like the Pentagon. Others felt the site and its ruins should become a monument to the people who died that day, like the field in Pennsylvania. In the end, it was decided to erect one new tower and place a memorial where the old towers had once stood. After darkness, light. On September 11, 2001, 19 hijackers committed the worst acts of terrorism ever aimed at the United States, changing that country and the world forever. Each year on September 11th, Americans find ways to remember the victims. Many people attend memorial services. Children often wear red, white, and blue to school, the colors of the American flag, and raise money for projects that help others in their communities. In a town in Pennsylvania, some victims' family members decided to honor their loved ones by building a garden. At this garden, completed in 2006, visitors can take a memorial journey to remember all those who were killed on 9/11. The journey starts in a tear-shaped area and winds past fragments from the Twin Towers. Then it passes a wall etched with the victims' names. Finally, the walkway leads visitors away from these signs of sorrow to a cluster of young trees that stand for hope. The theme of this journey captures America's struggle to find hope following the tragedy. Its theme is After Darkness, Light.
Little Fox.